There is a great saying that goes, if it's real, it can take the pressure. If something is challenged and people go absolutely mental over it being challenged, then you know its foundation could be shaky and the whole thing could potentially be false or fictional. But if they laugh it off with a smile, then you know it's probably legit and real. The teachings attributed to Jesus Christ are not simply one-dimensional. They move across multiple layers from simple, accessible moral lessons to profound mystical insights. Traditionally, scholars and spiritual seekers recognize a progression from exoteric, meaning outer teachings, intended for the more general population, to esoteric, meaning inner teachings, meant for those ready for deeper gnosis. So each one of these layers gets more sophisticated and is thus typically understood and appreciated by fewer and fewer people. So here comes the pressure. Ready? Since much of Abrahamic religion tries to water down esoteric practices into fictional, exoteric historicity, doctrine, and dogma, not to mention be designed to be decoupled from nature, having its Eucharist neutered, and is thus inferior to esoteric practices such as something like shamanism, which are based in direct Eucharistic experience in nature, we personally have absolutely zero interest in ever Christianizing our material. However, since imperial, theocratic, women-hating, weirdo Christian supremacists who only thirst for power and control have very unfortunately gotten more of it in 2025 and are going to continue to try and make all of our lives in the country we reside in shittier and worse via their Project 2025, which has a lower approval rating than herpes, because of our spiritual philosophic knowledge, we will continue to try and insert some higher consciousness information in about Christianity into our work on occasion to push back against the usual idiocracy view of said subject. And since we live in a country with a great deal of Christians, many crap, some good, and a smaller percentage of which really to quite decently good, we're going to try and continue to share what we realize are multiple layers to the Christ onion, from most false to most real, beginning with the most exoteric, watered-down fictional to the most esoteric truthful. So the fictional Christians will have their head spin around 360 degrees while projectile vomiting and not even be able to process this, despising it and want to send us their reactionary hate comments, which will likely be preemptively disabled. But more true Christians should find it eyebrow-raising and perhaps even compelling, because we wish the more sophisticated ones nothing but the best. And if you grew up with this stuff and you're not willing to continue to try moving towards being one of them, please do turn this off now. So before this begins, a massive warning regarding only truth seekers may enter. Those who want to live in illusions have been warned. Layer 1, most fake layer. Pop culture Jesus, white Republican corporate megachurch Jesus. First of all, the fact that your church looks like a shopping mall or a stadium and is the size of an Imperial Star Destroyer should tell you that it has nothing to do with spirituality, meaning nature, and everything to do with corporate greed and a thirst for money and power. Older churches had very often been built on older pagan, druidic, and indigenous sites, co-opting them like the Borg Collective, with an assimilate or die attitude that they had for thousands of years and sometimes still do today, pushing their "this is a Christian nation" inaccuracies on the rest of us. This is based in Babylon, empire, and hate, and is what virtually all ultra-conservative Republicans are for, and why they're in end-times death cults that want Christian nationalism, which just means Christian supremacy, not to mention their relationship with the settler colonial state of Israel, because they literally think their savior will be resurrected and returning to earth. Not happening. They are in a theocratic religious cult, nested in a corrupt political red cult, nested in a zombie idiocracy wannabe fascistic MAGA cult of assholes. They always say the Second Amendment is there to protect the First Amendment, while not knowing the First Amendment has a wonderful philosophical Enlightenment separation of church and state that is secular for good reasons. Disempowering yourself by looking outside of yourself for a quick fix is easy, which is what anyone who has ever said the phrase, "I accept Jesus Christ as my Lord and personal Savior" is doing. Dealing with your own personal life problems and the reasons for them is the real spiritual path and is very hard. So corporate megachurches are very full as a result. They have no interest in the spiritual self-development of each member of their flock, but instead just spoon-feeding the mind-controlled, dogmatic, vertical, patriarchal hierarchy, of which the fictional white Jesus character, the one you see in Mel Gibson movies, is claimed to actually have been a real incarnated man to look outside of yourself to in the male daddy hierarchy, because decoding parables and myths require too much thinking for their bird brains. Outside of wanting a theocracy, they're not for much of anything except hating those who are not in their cults and reducing women's rights. They consciously hate evolution because they are unconsciously de-evolving. They are the dark side of the force, being rotted by their own hate, because they secretly all hate themselves and are demonstrably sexually repressed, and their deplorable behavior, being the largest voting bloc, being totally down for fascism, is evidence of that. From one angle, we could title them Dark Imperial Hate Christians, or from another angle, we could call them the title of Chinos, meaning Christians in name only. It's Fred Phelps, Westboro Baptist Church, American Taliban style, Toilet Paper USA, and they are the bottom barrel worst part of the United States, who are unfortunately way too coddled, and us being interested in occultism means they want to burn us at the stake. And as that freedom-loving American who deeply cares about the First Amendment, which gives us both simultaneously the freedom of speech to say these things and the separation of church and state to keep their narrow and shallow Ten Commandment religious indoctrination out of our American as apple pie secular schools, we will never stop calling them out, so you're welcome. If you or someone you know is in this very large cult, especially a self-hating woman, please advise them to get out ASAP. Deeper layer number 2. Poor brown immigrant hippie from Palestine Jesus. We, being of Caucasian descent, are not a self-hating white person, as we can both respect and appreciate the good aspects and beauty of European cultures, especially Scandinavian cultures where our ancestors hail from, while simultaneously saying that Europeans have been very imperial over time and that Nazis are losers. Even though exoteric, historical, corporeal Jesus is a myth, if we pretend he was a real magical man who lived for 33 years with the unicorns for 1 microsecond, he would never have been a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. There is a tendency, as a result of Western Empire, to consciously or unconsciously assign a higher value to the Caucasian race than other races, mainly based on inaccurate cultural stereotypes, ethnocentrism, and societal trends rather than on scientific analysis and historical method, thus doing the white savior thing. This is even done through much of South America, which is brown, yet still culturally often incorrectly assigns whiteness to the Christ figure. In reality, he would have been more a poor, brown, hippie Jew, and would thus be coming more from that point of view and life experiences of extreme struggle. There are more poor white people in the United States, our country, than any other demographic. So the last thing we're saying is that white does not mean poor. And liberation theology interprets the teachings of Jesus Christ through the lens of social justice, political activism, and the liberation of the oppressed, because those are the similar things to what the Christ teachings actually talk about. This represents more true liberal Christianity, which is for helping the poor regardless of skin color, and certainly not hating gay people like most fake Layer 1 does. But it still tends to cater to male hierarchy, and is thus not totally free from Babylon, meaning empire. When you hear a nicer, more horizontal, moral, compassionate Christianity from a historical context from someone like Martin Luther King Jr., or in a more modern context from someone like James Tallarico or Reverend William Barber, they are not mean Christians, but instead understand that neither poverty nor extreme morbid wealth should even exist, catering more towards the middle and bottom of the socioeconomic hierarchy, not to mention hating women while pretending to care about life. Speaking of the feminine, another example is Bishop Marion Budd, who with one look at her you can tell she fits right in with the Portland, Oregon lesbian Subaru driving crowd, who dared to ask one of the least Christian people on spaceship Earth, the short-fingered orange vulgarian, to be more Christian and thus show compassion towards immigrants, and as a reminder, his plastic trophy daughter wife, who doesn't even like him, is one, as well as gay and trans people who might be fearful of his administration. On this note, we highly recommend the books How to End Christian Nationalism and Christians Against Christian Nationalism by people from group number 2 who, unlike those from group number 1, have actually studied the real Christ teachings, which, like all true religions, should be love and light, because they are less slaves to money, power, and thus empire, but more cater to a service-based monastic life of devotion to what their operating system calls God. These are basically just nicer, non-pushy, non-asshole Christians who may still think that heaven or hell are actual real things and not fairy tales, or at least know that they are parables which have value regardless of historicity. Because what is religion other than a fantastical way of dealing with death? Layer number 3, even deeper layer, sun worship. When people are more uneducated or mentally dim, it's difficult, if not impossible, to try and give them downloads through more multi-layered, sophisticated, and advanced means. It's easier to communicate to them through human stories, which are passed on through generations around campfires. This is one of the reasons why parables and mythology through eons are often turned into stories of fictional historical people. Things that have evolved beyond crude matter are corporealized. That, and it helps the empire by getting each person to look outside of themselves. From the esoteric to the exoteric, which might possibly be the oldest trick in the book. If you're determined to find physical exoteric, meaning outer evidence of Jesus, simply look up during the day at what scientists call a burning ball of gas in the sky, flat earthers claim is not very far away, and what we might hint may or may not be a dimensional converter. As Christ was never even a historical figure, but is simply what's called a corporealization of the sun in the sky. That's right, the Son of God is really the S-U-N of God. Early Christian iconography nearly always depicted Christ with solar imagery, with the sun behind their heads, and churches, like pagan rituals, often faced east towards the sunrise. Imperial darker Christianity over time absorbed and rebranded earlier pagan sun cult motifs, blending celestial symbolism with theological narratives to apply to a wider audience in the ancient world. Jesus, often referred to as the light of the world, had their traits copied from sun deities. Born near the winter solstice, rising and setting like the sun, and being resurrected after a period of darkness during the winter solstice. This is why the winter solstice was said and simply is a worship, veneration, and appreciation for the sun and the sky, which made your crops grow. And due to Christianization, the winter solstice was turned into Christmas, meaning Christ's Mass. Does this mean the Christian version of the winter solstice is not to be appreciated? Of course not, and as long as it's one of many options, which more inclusive option 2 would allow for, but the problem comes in when exclusive option 1 of Empire does their marketing pitch and says you can only celebrate via the Christian version. A great quote of which regarding says, "On Christmas Eve, we tend to celebrate the misdated birth of a displaced, impoverished, liberal Palestinian Jew who was wrongly executed by a dictatorship at the behest of corrupt religious leaders, and whose most ardent modern-day followers believe would endorse a thrice-married convicted felon adulterer who stole money from charities and continues to slander and lie to amass personal political power by cheering on a dead Turkish Catholic bishop who commands a workforce of enslaved elves to make gifts for children he creepily spies on all year, and then morphs into a psychic, magical globetrotter with super-powered reindeer. Welcome to the Coca-Cola version of Xmas." During the genocidal, settler-colonialist founding of the United States of America, one of the most well-known Native American practices by tribes such as the Lakota, Sioux, Cheyenne, Blackfoot, Apache, and Crow was the sun dance, a nature-based and thus real spiritual practice that was for renewal, sacrifice, and connection with the Great Spirit and coincides with the summer solstice. And guess what? It was banned by ultra-imperial religious North American settlers who happened at the time to be in charge of the United States and Canadian governments. And with the dark Project 2025 Nazgul of the time of this writing, little has actually changed from how colonial governments suppressed indigenous spirituality then and now. But its revival is a testament to native resilience and cultural survival. In a more modern context of this example, a tried and true staple of one of Empire's modern propaganda channels, that is Fox so-called news, where one dumb enough to listen will hear bottom barrel statements such as, "We're on Christmas," or "We can't say Merry Christmas and only have to say Happy Holidays." But Happy Holidays implies plural celebrations. Merry Christmas implies one, doesn't it? On a final note, notice how we didn't use the word he when talking about deeper Christ layer 3 here. One of the tricks of Empire is to degrade or remove the feminine in terms of importance and only cater to the masculine's importance, when in reality both have equal value. An example would be that we call our male children our sons and our female children our daughters, when they should instead be called our moons. Think about that. This is a deeper separate conversation, but we suggest listening to our insight titled God is Non-Binary, about how any supreme being which exists in unity cannot be only one half of the male and female sexual binary, but instead would be both in perfect balance. That being said, in alchemical artwork related to the Western esoteric tradition, the sun is designated as male and the moon is female, and the reason for that is a deeper conversation related to the final Christ layer. Now, this is where we really cross a threshold and are going to reiterate what we said earlier related to fake white Republican Jesus, prior to mentioning more real poor brown immigrant hippie from Palestine Jesus, and then even more real sun in the sky Jesus. The worst aspects of Abrahamic religion try to indoctrinate people through dogma and doctrine and then lead them into regressive politics, and that's basically all it does. The problem with this is that it's not interested in spiritual self-development, which is what we are very interested in and what our work tries to lead you towards, which is essentially improving and evolving yourself while becoming less dysfunctional, basically becoming a better person through your own direct experiences and working on yourself. We've been saying this for well over a decade, but we'll mention this again, that this is an internal process. It's not an external process. Each one of us is a unique snowflake, and the path is custom designed for each of us. This is why someone on stage speaking to a large group can only be so-so at best, and far too often is just a grifter in the process. The real alchemical gold comes from small groups or even better one-on-one teacher and student relationships, similar to a client or patient who is in a therapy session in a modern context with a therapist in an air-conditioned office, or in an indigenous context working with a shaman outside in nature. So it's really teachers who should be wise elders who are essential in this process, which can possibly come from a good layer number 2 pastor who may be excellent. But such people within church hierarchy tend to be more the exception than the norm. The real benefit from a decent layer number 2 church are the potential communities built there. As we would never say you can't go to church, as anyone who wants to be a Christian, especially a more real one, and finds benefit in the community from going to church, fair enough. Our mother used to go to a very liberal Unitarian Universalist church herself and liked the community from it. And it was very far from an ultra-aggressive, culty Imperial Star Destroyer church of hate like layer number 1 demands and requires. But it's very important to realize that you don't need to go to any church for it, or any priest or guru or class to access it. So the final 2 layers of the Christ onion are not exoteric outer things, but more real, true, esoteric inner layers, as there is a relationship between outer light and inner light. Layer number 4, the initial sophisticated esoteric layer, awakened imagination. Now, it's hard to touch on this without mentioning an absolutely incredible human being who lived in his last adult incarnation that we know of from 1905 to 1972. And like every single individual in physical form was not perfect, but is a wonderful source, one of the best for biblical study. Because the Bible, while written by man, and we'll say that again, written by man, is also far from perfect, but has some really good stuff in there none the same. Neville Goddard was a spiritual teacher, mystic, and author best known for his teachings on the power of imagination and consciousness as a creative force behind reality. His work blended real Christian mysticism, New Thought philosophy, and a unique interpretation of Scripture as psychological allegory. His core philosophy was essentially that imagination creates reality, and at the heart of his teachings was the principle, assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled. In other words, whatever you vividly imagine and emotionally inhabit in your inner world will, to some extent, manifest in your outer world. Your consciousness is God, and your imagination, the Christ consciousness or inner light of awakened imaginative mind, is the mechanism through which reality is shaped. Goddard didn't interpret the Bible literally and cautioned heavily about claiming it's in any way historical. He knew it was what it really is, which is a series of allegorical stories as psychological drama, with characters and narratives symbolizing states of consciousness. Much of his books and lectures are decoding of what biblical passages are really saying, as allegory for your own higher self, personal story through your life, which are timeless and recurring. For example, Jesus does represent the awakened imagination. Crucifixion is the death of the old identity, and resurrection is the assumption of a new self-concept. It also says that every soul is composed of light, true, and that Christ is a state of mind like the Father and I are one, or seek the kingdom of heaven within you, not outside of you. This type of spiritual philosophy and real Christianity is both mystical and deeply practical. It requires no external authority, no dogma, and no institutional structure. It simply asks you to recognize your own consciousness as divine and to use that awareness consciously, creatively, and lovingly. To live as Goddard suggests is to take full ownership of your life, not by willpower or effort, but by faith and imagination. And in a big corporate machine world often dominated by empire that often denigrates the imagination and certainly doesn't want people being truly creative, let alone making a living off their creativity, but instead having a slave job, there is always the marketing pitch of fear and limitation over what is true, which is abundance. Because of this type of mental empowerment, even though we of course live under a multiplicity of both physical and mental dynamics, if you first improve the mind, you improve the body before you can improve your surroundings and your life and the health of the well-being of your community and then the country and then your planet. So this empowering philosophy of mind is both ancient and urgently modern and anti-empire. Layer number 5, an even deeper esoteric layer and an initiatory hint. Now, there is an even deeper fifth layer to the Christ onion, which is, of course, deeply occult and esoteric and is spiritually advanced enough that it starts touching on and heading into aspects of the real initiation process, which, to use a popular culture reference, so people have some frame of reference of what we're talking about, is like when Luke Skywalker goes to train with Yoda in the Dagobah system, with Luke as student and Yoda as teacher, one-on-one. We ourselves, having had some experience with a series of teachers, one of the agreements of which is to never tell another soul or share real initiatory information with that is remotely giving hints as to what the initiatory process is, somewhat, and how it works. None of which is to ever be shared publicly because the last thing we want it in the hands of are higher level Palpatine Dark Imperial agents who administer masses of lemmings into group number 1. But what we will share about it now is that when you're in it, it basically is an idiot realization accelerator, and you come to realize that you are the idiot. And like the psilocybin mushroom would tell you at high doses, that you don't know shit about shit, no matter how hot shit you thought you were before beginning the process. One passage in the Bible that is very true says, "Many are called, few are chosen." And because real initiation is so esoteric, difficult, complex, not to mention, of course, initiatory, extremely few people would even get it, so it's not even worth trying to explain here in this writing for the private members section of our website, nilesheckman.org, which then goes out as audio only to our podcast and audio and video to our channel. And you would all think we're an oddball for even trying to do so, if you don't already. One additional thing we will say is that this is an early and more simplified version of a featured documentary film we are developing around this content, currently titled Layers of Light. And it would be totally inappropriate to share it there either, God forbid sell it and try and share it. But in that, which will be an expanded upon version of this writing and narration, we will probably encode a secret line or two that gives an ever so deeper hint as to what it could orbit around, just like the old alchemists did in their books.